Hi, welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be doing the classics book tag. I found a lot of different videos that are called classic book tags and they have different questions. So I kind of pulled the questions that I liked in order to put this together. And so without further ado, I'm going to jump right in. So I didn't like the order also of a lot of them, so I'm going to do it in a little bit of a different order. So first question is, how often do you read classics? It really depends month to month. I would say I usually read in between 1 to 3 classics a month. It just depends on how busy the month is. I have been trying every month to read a novel that is a classic. So if I only read one classic, it will be a novel. But lately I've also been trying to include a work of philosophy and an epic poem. I just can't always finish those every month, so those I tend to get through one every 2 months. So the next question is my favorite editions of classics that I like to collect. I wouldn't really say I like to collect classics. It's more if I like a book, I will purchase it. Or if a classic seems really interesting, I will buy it with the intention of reading it. But I'm really trying to limit doing that because I feel like there's so many books I buy and I don't end up reading. So when it comes to classics, I do like to start by looking for either the Penguin or the Oxford classics. I just find they tend to have very good introductions included in them, so that's why I like them. So I'll start with the Penguin Black classics because those are the ones I have the most of. I tend to buy the Penguin Black classics mainly because they have the most books available in their collection. I would rather buy a Penguin Black classics than just buy the classic itself, mainly because I find these editions have introductions. But the reason I don't love the Penguin Black classics is I feel like the books get really battered and torn as you're reading them. So for example, I have The Republic by Plato, which I still have not finished. I really need to finish this because I really like it. I just haven't forced myself to sit down and work through it from beginning to end. But just from reading it every now and then, you see how the front page is like all tattered and the spine doesn't look great. I just find the wear and tear on these makes them look much older than they really are. Like, I don't even think I've left my apartment with this book before. And I know like one of the pages has fallen out. So I like them, but they're not my favorite. I also don't find them to be the cheapest edition of the classics that you can get. My favorite edition of classics to collect is actually these Oxford World Classics, I believe they're called, with the white spine. I just find with the wear and tear is not as bad on these at all. Like, I have read this a few times actually, and you can't even tell the spine is still intact. There's just a little bit of like a scratch on the front and a fold. But other than that, very little wear and tear. I also like these because they are cheaper than the Penguin Black classics. And I also will say I find their introductions a little bit better. Some of the introductions in the Penguin Black classics are great, but others are not good at all. Whereas I find in these Oxford World Classics, almost always the introduction is excellent. Like, if I'm looking for an introduction to a book, I always come to these ones first. So since I'm holding this book, I'm actually gonna segue into the next question, which is an underrated classic. I think The Symposium by Plato is such an underrated classic. I never hear people talking about it, or like very rarely hear people talking about it. And it's so good. This is the first work by Plato that I've read. I've read some of his other works within the Final Days of Socrates collection, which consists of 5 dialogues. What I like about the Symposium is it's essentially a dinner party with different people talking about their ideas of love. I like it for 2 reasons. First, I find love a really fascinating concept. I've always been interested in the philosophy of love, and so this is like the first book people recommended if you are interested in learning about that. But what I really like in terms of being able to read philosophy is all of the different characters give speeches on their idea of love. And so it's much easier to follow than other Platonic dialogues where people are going back and forth. With this, you can read, let's say, Socrates' dialogue, and just from that, you understand Socrates' position on love. So I find it much easier to understand than really any other of Plato's dialogues. And that's why I'm surprised people don't talk about it more. It's also really short. I think it's like 90 pages. Oh, it's actually less than that. It's like, this edition is 72 pages. I mean, I wouldn't read it in a sitting, but I think what I did is I read all of the different speakers each day. So I remember one of the speakers was Aristophanes, so I read Aristophanes like in the morning before work, and you can still finish it within like a week or so doing it that way. So yeah, I would say this is underrated because I don't really hear people talking about it really at all. In terms of fiction, I would say an underrated classic is The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy. I don't have that. I listened to the audiobook from my local library. I do like Tolstoy, but I think a lot of his work is just really, really long. And if you're someone who isn't really into reading, it's completely unrealistic to be like, oh, I'm gonna read War and Peace this year. I've been trying to get through War and Peace for months and I still have not gotten through it, and I love reading and I love literature. This novella was actually the first work of Tolstoy that I read. It's very short. I think it was like a 3-hour audiobook, so really great if you don't have a lot of time. Definitely something you can get through over a weekend. And I find the issue within the novella is really interesting. So this follows a man who was a lawyer and then became a judge, and then comes to realize that he has a terminal illness. And so the novel really explores him coming to terms with his own morality, really questioning how he lived his life. A really great work of existentialism, I would say. And like I said, really short, doesn't take up tons of your time, has a really great message to it. The character is quite unlikable, but I think that's a good thing. I also think it really shows how easy it is for people to just go through life without questioning the things that they're doing and the way that they're living their life. And at the end of the day, all of our time here is limited. And so for me, it really is a book that raises the question, like, what am I doing here? What is my purpose? What do I want to get out of life? And my time here is limited. How do I want to be spending my time? There is a film adaptation which is based on the death of Ivan Ilyich, so I want to talk about my favorite adaptations of classics. So I feel like adaptation is a word that's used very, very loosely, because initially when I thought of the word adaptation, I was thinking of taking a classic story and then retelling it in some way. But one adaptation I have watched is Ikaru by Akira Kurosawa, and he was a Japanese filmmaker, and it essentially is a retelling of the death of Ivan Ilyich, but done in a modern way. Follows a Japanese man who realizes he has a terminal illness, and then the movie shows how he chooses to go about living his life once he discovers that prognosis. I will say I preferred the death of Ivan Ilyich to Ikaru, the movie. I just like what Tolstoy did with that storyline a little bit more. But it is a cool adaptation. It's black and white. I think it's from the 50s, like 1952, and obviously subtitled. So not for everybody, but it's a really interesting watch if you have the time, and that's available on the Criterion channel. I know they made another adaptation of that. I think it was a British film called Living. I've not watched that, but I know that that is based on Ikaru, so I guess it's also an adaptation of The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy. So staying within this concept of adaptation, there are a few novels that I haven't read but I really want to read, which are adaptations of classics. The first is An Orchestra of Minorities by Chigozie Obioma, who is a Nigerian author. I've been wanting to read this book for like 3 years now and just have not gotten around to it. I would say Nigerian and also African American literature is the area I feel the most well versed in, because growing up I read quite a lot of Nigerian literature and quite a lot of African American literature. So lately I've just been trying to explore literature from other areas, so that's part of the reason I haven't gotten around to this yet. But I do want to read this by the end of the year. And from my understanding, this is a retelling of the Odyssey, but it is based on the Igbo tradition. And one of the characters, it might even be the main character, is told from the perspective of the Chi, which is like something within Igbo mythology. Anyway, I really want to read that. Sounds really fascinating. I think I should probably read the Odyssey first and then read this. The second adaptation that I really want to read, this one I definitely will read. I might even read it this month. And that is Adam Buenos Aires by Leopoldo Marichal. He was an author from Argentina. My understanding is this is essentially a modern adaptation of The Inferno by Dante. Again, I haven't read it, so I'm not sure how far from the truth that is, but I really want to read it. The only reason I haven't read this book is it's not available as an audiobook, and I typically listen to fiction as audiobooks, so I just have to find time to force myself to sit down and read it. On a little bit of a side note, I do think this month I will finally have some time to read some fiction books. I was considering reading Intermezzo by Sally Rooney, and I started listening to the audiobook and I really did not like the narrator. So I probably will have to read that book rather than listening to it. So I'm hoping if I start with Intermezzo, then I can afterwards read Adam Buenos Aires. A few other film adaptations I just want to talk about really quickly. First is War and Peace by Sergei Bondarchuk, and this is a 4-part, I guess it's really a mini series at that point, but it's the 4 books of War and Peace put in movie form. This actually won Best Foreign Film. It might have even won multiple years, but I don't know, I can't remember for sure. But for someone who is struggling to read War and Peace, and I would put myself in that position, I am really struggling to get through it. I think what I'm gonna do is watch the movie. I've watched the first 3 parts, but I didn't watch the 4th one because I didn't want spoilers. But I think I'm gonna just watch all of the parts and then listen to the books as I'm going. I know a lot of people say it's better to read the book first and then watch the movie, but sometimes the movie is better than the book. For example, Killers of the Flower Moon, I would have never finished that nonfiction book if I had not watched the movie. And I kind of am feeling that way about War and Peace. I think there are just so many characters that it's much more interesting to watch and have like a visual of all of the people who are saying things as opposed to just trying to mentally follow who all of the characters are. So that is my homework for the rest of the year, to finish Sergei Bondarchuk's War and Peace and then to read the book. But the reason why I like that adaptation is it's very similar to the book, whereas I find most War and Peace adaptations are much shorter, and a lot of the parts of the plot of the book are completely cut out. I also think that Malcolm X by Spike Lee is a really great film adaptation. I feel like this is an unpopular opinion as a Black person, but I actually really do not like Spike Lee's movies. This is probably the only one I will say I like. And I thought that I was just being a little bit of a hater, but I recently came across some of Bell Hooks' critiques of Spike Lee's work. She also was not a fan. She has 2 essays. One was about Do the Right Thing and the other was about She's Gotta Have It. And reading those, I completely agreed with everything she was saying. So not a big Spike Lee fan, but I think his movie Malcolm X is really good. I think the autobiography of Malcolm X is a modern classic. And the movie is really great. Obviously you have Denzel Washington playing Malcolm X, so excellent actor choice. But really good if you are at all interested in Malcolm X and his life. And I feel like the movie is actually very similar to the autobiography, so I will give Spike Lee credit for that. So if you don't know, there's part of me that honestly has a taste of like a 70-year-old British woman. And by that I mean I quite like the BBC adaptations of Shakespeare. They were done, I think, in the 70s, like they're a little bit old, but if you do have access to BritBox, they're all on there. And it's the only place I found that has essentially every single Shakespeare play in movie form. They also have some of Shakespeare's plays that I don't think have like ever been made as films. For example, King Henry VIII, which like no one talks about but is so good. I love that play. I think it's so interesting, especially because you have all the history of like Henry VIII, the Protestant Reformation, the arguments between like the Catholic Church and the Church of England, all super fascinating, all in a play. Excellent. I currently am watching their adaptation of Julius Caesar, which is good. I will say Julius Caesar is a very hard play. I'm trying to get into Shakespeare, but I probably should have chosen a little bit of an easier play, but that's okay. We're gonna do this. October, I'm gonna finish it. The next question is, do you read fairy tales, folklore, and mythology? No, but I am trying to read a little bit more mythology. I know last year I read Theogony by Hesiod. I think that's how you pronounce his name, which I thought was absolutely fantastic. If you are at all interested in Greek mythology and like how all of that came about and their understanding of like creation, excellent. It's really short too. I think it was like a 2-hour audiobook that I listened to. I will say there's a lot of information in a very short period of time. So I think if I reread it, which I will read the actual book just because there's so much information. But yeah, reading that made me realize I do actually quite enjoy mythology. So I am looking to read a bit more mythology, a bit more like epic poetry that's ancient. I also have read the Iliad by Homer, which I think would fall under mythology, but correct me if I'm wrong. And I did actually really like that. Long-winded answer, no, I do not, but I'm looking to read more. I don't really think I'm gonna read fairy tales anytime soon. Like maybe if I have kids, then I'm like looking for books that would be good to read for them. But yeah, I don't really read a lot of like children's literature or young adult literature right now. So there's one question which is like favorite illustrated or graphic classic. I will say I actually do not know any illustrated or graphic classics, so maybe let me know if people have one that they want to share. I mean, my favorite graphic is Persepolis, but I don't know if that's considered to be a classic. I mean, I would say it should be. It's all about the Iranian Revolution told from the perspective of this young Iranian girl. I actually read it in French because I was trying to practice my French, so I probably should reread it in English, but overall, really great book. The next question is, what was the last classic you read? And that was Blind Owl by Sadeh Hedayat. This is a novella by an Iranian author. It was very strange, very sort of surreal. So I would say, overall, I did not really like this book, but I found it really interesting because I've never come across a book like this from an Iranian author. It felt like a combination of Kafka and Dostoevsky with then like an Iranian spin to it. As I was listening to it, I was thinking about Kafka's Metamorphosis and then a lot of Dostoevsky's novels. His shorter novels really definitely gave me Notes from the Underground vibes. Also The Double, which I hate that book. I really, really despise it. But I got The Double vibes and also a little pinch of Crime and Punishment. So if you like any of those books, give this a go because it was really fascinating, very, very different. But I don't really like those books with the exception of Crime and Punishment. So it wasn't really for me, but I could appreciate it for what it was. At least I think I could. The next question is, what classic are you reading right now? I am currently reading Paradise Lost by John Milton. I have been trying to read this book for about a year now. I told myself I really wanted to read this because what this book is really about is an exploration of Satan and the story within Christianity of Eve in the Garden of Eden and then man's fall from grace. Within the Bible, there are all of these things that Satan does, and I'm like, okay, yeah, that seems really evil. But I didn't really understand, like, what caused Satan to be evil in the first place? Like, if God made everything good, then, like, why is there this evil thing? Like, you know, like, I don't understand it. I don't understand it at all. And I also have always been really interested in pride because they say that Satan's biggest issue is that he had pride. And I feel like pride is not really something that we really talk about now anymore. So I was just really interested to see if at all Milton deals with some of these issues and explains some of them. My biggest issue with this is the way that it's written. The way I would describe it is imagine Dostoevsky written like Shakespeare, because the language is really, really challenging. And I was listening to a lecture about Milton, and from what I remember, they said he was trying to decide when he wrote this epic poem if he should write it in English or in Latin, and he decided to essentially go with like a fusion of the two. And that's what it feels like reading this. Like, there are so many words that I'm like, what is that? What was that word? And like, why are you choosing to put these words together? It's just so challenging to read because the language he uses is really complicated. I'm listening to this as an audiobook. If I sat down and read this, I would never finish it. I think I have about 3 hours left. I'm at a page 125. So I'm about to start book 6 and there's 12 books in total. So I'm almost halfway. I will just say, I did not enjoy this until I got to book 5. And when I got to book 5, it finally started clicking what this is about. But I can understand why people would not finish this book because it's very descriptive. Like, in a way that I don't think is at all necessary. I don't really like descriptive books. I like books that have interesting conversations or interesting philosophical sort of ideas. I don't like descriptions. I find them really tedious to get through, and there's a lot of describing in here. But what is good is when the description is over, you end up having really fascinating conversations between the characters. So in book 5, which is when it finally got interesting, at least for me, there were these fascinating conversations happening between Raphael, who is an angel, and Adam, who within Christianity is like the first man. And they were having these fascinating conversations about free will and then nature, free will. So it essentially is like a work of theology, but in epic poem form. Really, really good. Like when it gets good, it's excellent. When those conversations are not happening, I don't like it at all. But now at least I'm invested and I want to finish it. So I'm really hoping I can finish it this week. I have a week off of work and I'm planning to just like do a chapter a day and get through this bad boy. The next question is, what is your favorite classic? I think eventually my answer would be The Divine Comedy by Dante, but I've only read the Inferno right now, so I just feel like I can't say that's my favorite until I finished all 3 books of The Divine Comedy. So I will go with a work of philosophy, and my favorite classic I've read ever is the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. This is a work of philosophy that is focused on virtue, and Aristotle essentially says, you know, for a lot of people, they think the purpose of life is pleasure, living a life of enjoyment. Whereas for Aristotle, he says that the way in which you live a good life is to be good, to have human goodness or like goodness of the soul. And he talks about the ways in which you can do that in a few different ways. So he talks about the moral virtues and the intellectual virtues. There were so many aspects of this work of philosophy that genuinely changed my life, changed the way I think about the world, changed the way in which I think. For example, even in the beginning, in the first book, Aristotle has this whole conversation about the soul and the nature of our souls and how within the soul there seem to be these 2 parts that are like working against each other. I feel like the part that I spent the longest learning and reading was about the moral virtues, because I just found his way of describing them so clear and like so easy to understand. So with Aristotle, he says a virtue is when you do something the right amount. So for example, he uses example of like friendliness. If you are too worried about being friendly, then you end up being a people pleaser. Whereas if you're not friendly enough, you're just like overly contentious and argumentative and not worried about how that might hurt people's feelings. And so Aristotle sort of explaining a virtue is right in the middle. It just made so much sense. Like now, I don't know, maybe for some people that's very obvious, but for me, it just was like a light bulb went off. And even some of the things that he talks about as virtues. So for example, he talks in one chapter about ambition. And he's like, ambition is good, but only to the right amount. If you don't have enough, then you're unambitious. I think that's obvious. But if you have too much, like it is possible to be too ambitious and to be ambitious over the wrong things, over a status to too high of a degree. A similar thing is like with anger. If you have too much anger, you're wrathful. If you don't have enough anger, you have wrathlessness. And if you have just the right amount, you're sort of gentle. You know how to be angry when you should be. So you're not like a pushover, but you're not angry all the time and always feeling like you've been slighted. And the one I'm interested in exploring the most is, in one edition it's called high-mindedness. In another it's called pride. And that's why I'm very interested in it, because I feel like now pride, at least within Christianity, pride has like a very negative connotation. But let's just use the term high-mindedness for now. So if you don't have enough of it, he calls you little-minded. And if you have too much, he says you're too vain or conceited. So high-mindedness or like pride is like just the right amount of that. And that one I find really interesting and I'm gonna look into more. Then there also are the intellectual virtues. I don't know those as well because I found that section a little bit more complicated. And so I wanna go back and reread that. And there is a whole section towards the end which is all about self-control versus passions. And that part I definitely wanna do a deep dive into because I've talked about this before, but part of the reason I really like Anna Karenina by Tolstoy is I like the exploration of the concept of passion. I feel like so many times now, like with modern movies, romantic comedies, like the focus and emphasis is on passion and like chemistry and a spark as an indication of like when that is an appropriate romantic relationship. And it's really interesting when you go back in history, that's not at all the way in which people went about trying to find life partners. I found Aristotle's section that all was about passion and self-control to be fascinating. And he talks about it in different areas because like, you know, you can be passionate when it comes to like anger, but also when it comes to like lust. I actually read 2 different editions because I found one edition, which was a more modern translation, was a little bit too modern. Like I felt like they were kind of missing some of the points Aristotle was trying to make. Whereas the older edition was a little bit too complicated to follow. So I want to reread it with like the perfect edition, and then I will finally make a video on that. I forgot to add that another reason why I really enjoy the Nicomachean Ethics is at the end he talks about how we can go about creating sort of good moral citizens in a society. And he talks about the fact that it's laws that are used in order to create good citizens. And if you want to learn how to educate people, you need to learn how to use laws to shape people's character. And I'm very interested in like how we go about educating people, how we go about creating moral citizens. And so, yeah, I just feel like that book is like the blueprint for so many things that I hope to eventually explore in future research that I do. Okay, and the last question is, what are the classics that I want to read? What classics are on my TBR list? And I have chosen to limit it to 3 with 1 honorable mention because I know myself and I will just go on and on about books I want to read for like 20 minutes. So, gonna keep this short and sweet. So the first book I want to talk about is Return of the Spirit, and this is a novel by an Egyptian author whose name is Tawfiq al-Hakim. And this novel follows a patriotic young Egyptian and his family around the time of the revolution in Egypt, which happened in 1919. This is an area of Egyptian history that I don't know a ton about, so I am really interested in learning more. And from what I can tell, it seems to be both an exploration of the character's political journey as well as a spiritual journey. And I always love novels that have a little bit of a spiritual element to them. I just feel like it takes the novel to another level. From what I can see, this novel has been compared to A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce, which I have not read but want to. And it's also been compared to The Sorrows of Young Werther. And that book I have read. I've actually read several times. So I'm interested to see what this novel is about, where it goes. I usually try and read a little bit of books before I film a TBR, but I'm not gonna do that for this one. I'm gonna let myself be completely surprised. The next classic I wanna read is a work of philosophy, and that's the Analects of Confucius. This is a collection of Confucius's sayings, which were compiled by his pupils shortly after his death. I'm just gonna read from the back of the book. Upholding the ideals of wisdom, self-knowledge, courage, and love of one's fellow man, Confucius argued that the pursuit of virtue should be every individual's supreme goal. And while following the way or the truth might not result in immediate or material gain, Confucius showed that it could nevertheless bring its own powerful and lasting spiritual rewards. So I have not read a lot of Eastern philosophy, and I want to change that. So I decided to start with this book. I started listening to the audiobook. It reminds me a little bit of the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which I didn't love. I'm not a big fan of philosophical fragments. I prefer a work of philosophy that's a little bit more compiled and intended to be read in that way. But I think it could be nice to, just sort of listen to a few of the sayings every few days and meditate on the ideas of Confucius. The next classic that I want to read is the Bhagavad Gita, and this is an ancient Hindu text. This text takes the form of a philosophical dialogue in which Krishna instructs Arjuna, the prince, in ethical matters and the nature of God. It seems to be fairly expansive in scope. It deals with instructions on yoga, postures, moral discussions, and is seen as a practical guide to living well. So I understand that this takes the form of an epic poem, and I've really been trying to read epic poetry from different countries or regions of the world. So I'm kind of interested to jump into this. I don't really know anything about Hinduism, so I am interested to give that a read. And just an honorable mention, I also want to read Conference of the Birds, which is also an epic poem. It falls within Sufism, within Islam. I'm not going to talk about that really because I do plan to read that within the next few days, so stay tuned for that. So if you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what your favorite classics are, or if you have read any of these books, I would love to hear it. If you're new to my channel, this channel is all about re-education and decolonizing the mind. I decided last year to go on a journey of decolonizing my own mind, and I created this channel as a way to share what I am reading and learning with the world. If you are interested in following along with me on this journey, then feel free to subscribe. And if you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you also for all of the love and support, and I will see you in the next one.